Thank you, Karin, for handling all the details and your great crew. Especially thank you, Greg, not only for inviting me, but for all the great work you're doing, changing the world, getting us out of the mess that we're in. So following the theme of the mess that we're in, I'm going to elaborate a bit on what you've already heard from both Gary and Zoe, a bit about dietary guidelines that are way off, but then really do a deep dive into the mess that we've seen with cholesterol information or misinformation. So I have a personal stake in why I'm up here. I'm a neuroscientist, been a neuroscientist for 40 years. I'm not talking about my neuroscience research. I'm talking about how this has affected me personally. 1999, I was diagnosed with a genetic anomaly called familial hypertriglyceridemia, which means I'm extremely efficient at producing fat. A person with my kind of genotype can be obese very easily. And so this was 1999, and you see that through 2007. So I battled this hypertriglyceridemia. I have my triglycerides, for example, were 800. HDL was extremely low at about 30. So you want your triglycerides HDL ratio to be maybe 2, no more than 3 to 1. My ratio was 25 to 1, which is extremely dangerous. So I took it very seriously. I exercised like crazy, and I followed the dietary guidelines, which you can see right here. And I'm sure Zoe will cringe at this. This was my guide. 1999, I knew a whole lot about the brain, but basically nothing about diet and heart disease. And so the American Heart Association website, I'm looking at reducing my saturated fats, went low in meat, exercised like crazy. I ate oatmeal so I could lower my cholesterol. I ate beans so I could lower my cholesterol. And so I followed these guides. I was very concerned about my cholesterol, concerned about saturated fat. By 2007, the only thing I had accomplished was my triglycerides went higher, my HDL went lower, and I got fat. I was never obese, but I was about 30 pounds heavier than I am now. I remember that moment, and it's actually at dietdoctor.com, which they interviewed me, that moment in 2007 when my doctor sat me down and said, "You've done your best. You've followed the diet recommendations, you've exercised, and you haven't been able to improve. You gained weight, and your triglycerides are still sky high. You must go on a statin." To which I was actually amenable at the time. I didn't know what statins were. But I do remember that moment when I said, well, I've got a PhD in biology. The least I can do is read about what is a triglyceride and what I should do about it. And I remember that moment in my office when I read a few papers on the physiology of triglycerides, and it just struck me. I said, damn. It's the bread and the potatoes and the sugar I've been eating. I've been so happy eating bread without butter. And so it's the bread that's driving up my triglycerides. So at that time then, I was struck by this epiphany that I'd been given the wrong information. A few papers led to a few thousand papers. And that's what led me to here to you today. Talk both about a little bit about diet, because you've heard plenty from Zoe already, but also about cholesterol. So as a result of what I've learned now, this is now about 10 years in which I've been sharing this information, what I've realized is everything you see up here is bogus, absolutely bogus. Or as my European UK friends, it's just rubbish. Okay? And so that's part of what you've already heard. This is just not right. And I want to cover just a little bit, so where did this come from? This fear of saturated fat. And so I think it's important to point out that to a great extent, there is one man that owns that misinformation, Ancel Keys. So 1961, here you see in the cover of Time magazine, a man who knew nothing about nutrition, knew nothing about heart disease, and this man was in charge to a great extent of nutrition and heart disease research in America. A man who had a bachelor's in economics, and I've heard he had 2 PhDs, but frankly, neither one had anything to do with nutrition or heart disease. And what did Keys say in 1961? Americans eat too much fat, too much saturated fat. You eat saturated fat, you raise your cholesterol, you damage your arteries. So Americans have to reduce their fat consumption, especially saturated fat, to almost nothing. And he stated this as a fact. This is what's so important. This was stated as dogma, not as a hypothesis. And there was absolutely no basis whatsoever for these recommendations. Now that's 1961. Here it is now, 2019. That same information is now being put forth. You go to the American Heart Association website. The same information is still there. They are demonizing saturated fat. They're recommending an ultra-low-fat diet. They're still recommending margarine over butter at this present time. And why? The American Heart Association is a private organization not beholden to anybody but their sponsors. They have no interest in the health of Americans. They have an interest in supporting their sponsors, which includes the corn and soybean oil industry and the pharmaceutical. This is what I have now learned in the past 10 years, and I'll elaborate on that a bit later. So I want to point out also that it's not as if we've learned something new about saturated fat and triglycerides. That information was all there before. So this is an incredibly important paper. It's coincidental. It's the same year that Ansel Keys is seen as the expert in the world, at least in the country, on diet. And he's demonizing fat. Well, here, Pete Ahrens at Rockefeller University published a paper studying people on low-carb or low-fat diet. And what they've come up with is carbohydrate-induced lipemia, which means you consume carbohydrates, you increase fat in your blood. And that's related then to obesity, 1961. And the effect was so profound that they showed the serum from a person on the high carbohydrate diet. The lipemic plasma related to consuming carbohydrates, and you see this thick serum right here, carbohydrate-induced lipemia. The same person who has this thick plasma is now put on a low carbohydrate diet. And they're now pointing out the clear plasma occurs when someone is put on a high-fat diet. So this is really nothing new. I mean, we are getting enlightened by talks such as Zoe and talks that Gary has given. But this information was out there decades ago. And so I also want to credit Zoe. And I don't need to go into any further because her work is just magnificent review, not only of the current literature, but she actually looked back at what did we know in the 1970s. And what we knew in the 1970s did not justify the dietary guidelines. We were misinformed. And she stated, and her group of authors stated, not only was it inaccurate at the time, those dietary guidelines should not even have been introduced. So the misinformation has been out there for decades. And only now I think we're getting so many people studying this that we're catching up to that misinformation. So what we have is clearly money. The food drug companies have proposed this cholesterol theory, which ultimately was the end of the diet-heart hypothesis. And it's clearly wrong. So the first phase, which I've only touched upon since we covered this all today, is clearly saturated fat consumption does not contribute to either obesity or heart disease on a low-carb diet. Okay, so now let's do a deep dive further into LDL. So does LDL, this is the meat of the talk, does cholesterol actually cause heart disease, and specifically LDL? All right, this is an incredibly important study. This is a powerful, influential study. It is still cited, even though you're looking at total cholesterol, this is a study that is repeatedly cited to the present day that cholesterol causes people to die as a result of artery blockage. So this is a Mr. Fit study in which you have middle-aged men that were followed, large number of middle-aged men over the course of many years, about 7 years or so. And you're looking at their vulnerability to die as a result of their cholesterol level. And so this is the rate of death, beginning with 1.0 is your reference value with the lowest cholesterol. And so as you go to higher levels of cholesterol, you are looking at higher rates of death from coronary heart disease. So from the 1 to the 2, you're looking at twice the rate of death. 2 to 3, 3 times. So at 4.0, you're looking at 400% deaths from coronary heart disease as a function of cholesterol. So the point of this article is, it's not just people with super high cholesterol that die of heart disease. Any small increment of cholesterol brings you closer to your deathbed. So I looked at this paper and I looked at the raw data. Okay? So I was curious as to what was the actual rate of death for the individuals in the study. I'm going to show you then the raw data in this study that shows the actual rate of death of the population, because this is just a ratio. So what percentage of people actually died as a result of their cholesterol levels? So on this scale here, you're looking up to 100%. You're looking at now at the percent of people that did not die, okay, as a function of their cholesterol levels. And that's in blue. Just take that in for a moment, okay? These people were horribly uncooperative. There almost nobody died in this study. And so the blue shows you the percentage of people that did not die, and they're almost all at 100%. So for ease of viewing, I'm going to put a line across at 99%. So 99% of the people did not die. So at the lowest level of cholesterol, you have slightly more than 99% did not die. And at the most extreme level of cholesterol, slightly less than 99% did not die. How do you get? It's the same data originating to make the blue bars as to make the red bars. How do you get from the blue bars to the red bars? Well, what you have here are the raw data again. 0.3% of the people with the lowest cholesterol died of coronary heart disease. If we go to the farthest extreme, where you've got the 4.0, meaning 400% increase in death. Most extreme value is 1.3% of the people died of coronary heart disease. Across the entire, essentially almost the entire spectrum of cholesterol levels, you have a difference of only 1%. And what did they do? Well, to calculate this level, you take the 1.3% divided by 0.3%, and you get 4.13. And that's how you create a 400% difference in the rate of death based on cholesterol. But the real difference is 1%. Now, why was it that Stamler used the data in red and not the data in blue in promoting the study and continuing to promote it? Because the cholesterol hypothesis was failing. Numerous studies have been looking for an association of cholesterol to heart disease death, and they had failed. Studies had been lowering cholesterol for decades, and they had failed. This was desperation time. Cholesterol hypothesis was dying, and so they had to promote this because they couldn't admit that looking at cholesterol itself is not associated with death.